Welcome everybody to the Don't Sink podcast. My name is Noah Battle. Today I have a special guest to introduce. His name is Noah Healy. He is a self-described recreational mathematician and also an algorithm developer, and he does many other things. So I'm going to welcome you to our podcast and let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here, Noah.
Definitely.
As you said, I am a recreational mathematician. My area of mathematical interest is computational mathematics, which that also leads to my professional work in algorithm development, and has also led to economic work, designing a new kind of marketplace that I'm trying to get patented. I also have a podcast with the former CTO of Reddit, where we discuss AI and its implications for society and technology.
Well, I guess I want to start off with just your story. How did you get to the point you are today, and how long have you been interested in mathematics?
Well, I guess I've been interested in mathematics more or less since I was introduced to it. Uh, I can recall playing around with multiplication um, and addition and negative numbers in early childhood, grade school, that kind of thing. Um,
Okay.
and then I was accelerated through mathematics in grade school, wound up going to college, kept taking math classes more or less continuously, and then got out and got a job. It was 2000, so getting jobs with internet companies was very easy, and so I did, and started learning computer programming um, from an actual sort of serious perspective. I had several computer classes, but wasn't terribly interested in computers at the time. The the teaching was essentially centered around visuals or game design, probably in an attempt to get people interested. And I wasn't interested in creating new games or the next version of Tron or whatever. So I was like, oh, okay, well, that's a toy for doing those things that I don't do much of, so I'm good. Uh, but once I sort of discovered the nature of these machines for doing math and what their implications for math were, I was hooked. And so I've been digging into them ever since. So basically 24 years now.
That's my whole life. 24. So, what could you say are your earliest influences in terms of mathematicians or people doing things that you wanted to see yourself doing?
Well, probably actually sci-fi. I started reading Silver Age sci-fi. That's sort of the 60s whiz bang ray gun style thing.
Right.
Star Trek is sort of a pastiche of Silver Age sci-fi.
Mm.
Star Trek isn't actual sci-fi because it doesn't really describe like what's going on, um,
Right.
like the actual underlying mathematics. But I read when I was 8 a book called Space Cadet by Robert Heinlein, and one of the rather lengthy subplots in the book is the slow learning of tensor calculus and some other tricks that our main character has to undergo in order to figure out how to appropriately astrogate, that is, set courses uh, for a ship in orbit around our solar system. And being Silver Age sci-fi, there's a few paragraphs sprinkled through that describe some of these basic uh, uh, mathematics that you use to do these things, which are in fact all accurate as far as they go. And so uh, that mathematization of problem sets became something where I have generally intersected with the mathematicians of the past is in discovering my rediscovery of their discoveries, if you will. So I'll noodle around with something, and this is fairly common in mathematics for people that are, particularly now where it isn't really practical to know everything, but even as you're coming along, you notice some cool idea to multiply quicker or do something with a graph or something like that, and then that gives you the information required to go look up what it is you've actually discovered, and that's when you find out that somebody else had that idea 2,000 or 200 or 20 years ago. More usually 2,000 than 20, I would say.
Yeah, I've always had a fascination with sci-fi too, and I've always wondered why they stopped doing that. They stopped explaining the scientific principles behind what's going on in the movie. It's kind of less of a trend now in the newer sci-fi movies.
Well, the science fiction genre has changed quite a bit.
Right.
The that distinction was actually a major point of contention between H.G. Wells and Jules Verne over a
Okay.
century ago, when Verne is
Wow.
sort of known as the father of science fiction, although these days a lot of people would prefer to describe Mary Shelley as the mother of science fiction. But Verne was very strict that what made a story science fiction and not just fiction was that what I call the page, but it doesn't have to be a page long, but just that description of what's going on. And in fact, the one in which one is his with the Nautilus? 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It is a page where he's describing how deep the pressure, what deep pressure really means, and consequently how tough a deep sea creature would actually have to be on the surface to be able to go from the deep sea to the surface and kind of stick around. And then once they get onto the Nautilus, there's pages and pages of Captain Nemo describing how this electrical system or that other thing works, uh, and there was an interest in a discipline with that. Campbell was a very big proponent and sort of insisted in many cases that occur. But publishing and taste shift, and as the genre moved much more mainstream after Star Wars, there was sort of a lot of interest in creating mass market and much more popular fare that most of the people didn't actually care about that. And so the dominant writers came not to care so much either. And so it became more of the space opera and, uh, sex and ray guns versus sex and swords versus sex and law offices. Um, it became yet another one of that kind of genre of general fiction.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I study film. I'm a film student, so like that kind of level of exposition for me is like immersive. So like when I'm watching movies, like I like that kind of background explanation of what's going on scientifically because it puts you more in the movie. And I wish they'd
It
bring
can
that
be
back.
done extremely well. I think The Martian is a great example of
Great
a
movie.
actual science fiction film that is doing the work, and
Hmm.
the the secret meeting scene with the stapler and um, uh, I forget the character's name, but the where they're describing the fact that if you accelerate all the way through, then you can actually shorten the time frame of the orbit. Um, and if Heinlein were writing that, then there would be like some differential equations that were written out and explain like what the power curve looks like, and how much you can speed things up, and why this works and why that doesn't.
I wanted to ask you about um, what you do on a day-to-day basis in terms of mathematics.
Well, I've got a few different things. There's just sort of to keep the brain sharp and whatnot. There's a handful of YouTube creators that create sort of short daily uh, calculus, algebra, functional equation type problems, and a few geometry ones. I don't actually watch most of those. I sort of check out their thumbnails, and if I can't solve the thumbnail in my head, then I watch them if it looks like there's a technique that I should be sort of brushing up on. But just sort of, you look at it and you're like, oh yeah, that's obvious. We're good. Um, so there's a few of those. My effort is sort of bent towards trying to get the word out on my market design. So sadly, I don't get to use as much time up for mathematics as I might like. But that's a big part of my day to day. But I have sort of a handful of problems that I'm interested in chewing on, and so I kind of bring them up for the nibble, and try to think about where approaches, points of attack are, and if I get an intuition and something seems fruitful, then kind of everything else takes the back burner for a little while I chase that down, and that doesn't always take a day, and so I kind of have to discipline myself and push it to the side, get back to
Yeah,
what I actually am supposed to be doing. But yeah, I've right now, I guess my kind of three interesting things I'm coping with are: one, last year it was proved, so in colloquial language, it was proved that trust and understanding are incompatible concepts. What was actually shown in technical language, for those that want to look it up, is that either uh, one-way functions exist, or efficient ways to calculate Kolmogorov information on linear bounded automatons is possible, and we don't know which one of those two things is true. And so working through sort of the philosophical and logical implications of of either understanding having a clear but unintelligible boundary, or uh, trustable information sources not existing in any universe that is complicated enough to contain arithmetic. So that gets into sort of philosophical meanings of logic and epistemology. So that's something I'm coping with. One of my other longstanding sort of queries is that, from what I can tell, multiplication in Euclidean geometry is fundamentally simpler than our current best bound of symbolic multiplication, and that suggests that there's something seriously wrong going on. And so I play around with whether or not there's some subset of multiplication that exists within Euclidean geometry that is fundamentally simple, or if there's something foundationally incorrect about the structure of Euclidean geometry that actually works against its apparent multiplicative successes. And then thirdly, uh, I'm playing around with approximating for a wide variety of potential applications, but one of the lead ones, this is a couple of years old now, but if you have children or you know people that have children, you might be familiar with the cake sharing algorithm. So if you've got a piece of something to share between two people, one divides it, and then the second one chooses whichever piece of the division that they want, and that's a fair division. And it doesn't matter who does the division or who does the choosing, as long as they're the two different players. This has, of course, been well known, and parents have been using it probably since before humans could speak, but a little while back, it was discovered that there are actually fair division mechanisms, given full divisibility of the thing being to be shared, that are possible with any number of players. The drawback is that it takes exponential time. So it's not quite this bad, but imagine if every extra person you put in doubled the amount of time. So the split and share, that's pretty simple. Maybe it takes like 5 seconds. 3 players would take like 10 seconds. That's not so bad. But 13 players is now up to 10,000 seconds. So you're talking about a little under 3 hours. And you put another 7 players in there and you multiply by another 128. And suddenly you're talking about spending a week for 20 people. And then something like 40 years for 30 people, and obviously fairness becomes some sort of diminishing and vanishing dream. I'm curious about some of the approximation techniques that have been used and whether or not approximately fair could be a meaningful concept, and whether or not by invoking approximate fairness we would be able to come up with actual like reasonable time algorithms for computing these kinds of things. So that's sort of where my heads are at these days.
That kind of sounds familiar to what you're doing with the systems and um
Yeah, that third
the markets.
one very much is the marketplaces are a device for common understanding to occur, and so I'm sort of curious whether or not uh, there's some sort of combination between these where we can solve these two problems, because one of the drawbacks of negotiation, the negotiation games approach, is that it invokes a problem that is exponentially difficult to solve to build one of these systems. Now, I've found a solution for commodity marketplaces, which are the broad sort of how major markets and financial systems actually work. But to extend it to other types of spaces would require a lot more effort than the 6 months it took me to solve this one problem. And so the I'm curious whether or not there's if work that I've been doing on that might apply also in these other spaces, or if something within them could bounce back and build a much deeper insight into negotiation games.
Yeah. Can you actually would you care to explain the coordinated discovery markets?
Absolutely. So the core idea is that there's 3 components to a deal. So it's not a buyer and a seller making a deal for goods for cash at a common agreement in a sort of platonic, purified environment of the deal. There's people that have goods that they're willing to sell at whatever individual prices they're willing to sell at. People that have cash that need those goods that are willing to buy them at whatever individual prices they're willing to buy them at. And there's the information about what those two groups' common interests in maximizing the amount of trade that occurs. So there's some price at which the amount that people want to sell is equal to the amount that people want to buy, and and the amount of money that they all make is the highest amount of money that they can all make doing that. And so the coordinated discovery market says, okay, well, these are three completely separate activities. They're different kinds of information. They're different kinds of ideas. They live inside the same person. So a person might want to buy and also have information about what a good deal is, and a person might want to sell and also have information about what a good deal is, but they don't have to. Somebody might just want to sell and might just not want to have to cope with that. They might, want to concentrate on their actual business. Or somebody might just have information about the future and not have any interest in actually transacting whatever the fundamental thing is. And so the coordinated discovery market creates three separate buckets or markets for those three separate groups. One that forecasts and negotiates where prices are going to be set and where they're heading, and two others that access those market prices and decide how much trade that they want to engage in, and by structuring things in that way, by sort of bringing people into these mega groups, we create a marketplace that is more focusedly competitive than the existing marketplaces can be, while simultaneously being more cooperative than even communal cooperative behaviors can be, because there actually is a common interest among everyone within a single role.
Right. I'm glad you explained it because when I was reading your explanation of it earlier, I was trying to grasp the whole thing and how just like the practical application of it, and now I see how that could actually change the world. So what would your um, examples of like a world where this is implemented or this is the new way people do things?
Well, you say you're 24, so you wouldn't remember the bad old days of the Iron Curtain and sort of
Mm-mm,
the East versus West, communist versus capitalist, but you might have read something about it in history books. Um,
definitely.
this marketplace works as much better than the kinds of markets we actually currently have, then those marketplaces worked over the command and control totalitarian environments of the communist dictatorships of the 20th century. Um, so just as China's sort of tentative abandonment of top-down control and moving towards some degree of market introduction pulled something like 500 million people out of absolute poverty and launched one of the most impressive and rapid economic expansions in human history. And just as West Berlin to this day is wealthier and more developed than East Berlin is, although that's evening out pretty rapidly now with 30 plus years to do so. Um, this would create an incentive around production, the likes of which have not been seen in human history. The current cost overheads of the current system are similar in magnitude to the profits of the current operators in our productive space. So if you eat food, wear clothing, live in housing, um, you're consuming, drive your car, the metal, the gas, the wood, the wool, the wheat, the the things that make up the world that surround us. About half of the incentive to produce those things is being chewed up by the system that brings them to not you, the consumer, but just the people that make the thing that you, the consumer, will eventually have access to. And so in a world where that shifts dramatically towards production, we could see something like the American West, where moving into rural areas and getting into productive work has return rates similar to getting to Silicon Valley, having one of the big, Sandhill Road firms hand you hundreds of millions of dollars and running off to blitz scale. Now, the ceiling will be a lot lower, but the rate of return would be basically the same, and something that instead of 5 or 6 people who happen to have gone to Stanford and been in the right fraternity could have access to, uh, hundreds of millions of people around the world could have access to.
Okay, so this is kind of like how the internet was the new age of like free information and everybody had access to information. This is like now everyone having access to market and everyone having access to market information.
So one of my go-to things is that we have computers, we don't use computers.
Right.
So the internet was adopted by the financial system, uh,
Mm,
and essentially what they did was they took the pieces that they had and they just built computer programs that imitated a human being that did that. So um, there would be, and this goes all the way back to like the telegraph days. They've been doing this for centuries at this point. So they used to have people that would talk on the phone to external brokers, get the deal memo, write down some things, and hand it to a human being whose job it was to take that piece of paper, run across the floor, and hand it to somebody that was actually going to be in a position to make the deals that were directed to make on that piece of paper. Um, but you've got the internet. You don't need that person. You could Bluetooth that in and get more efficiency out that way. Um, so imagine if you had modern robotics and mechanical technology, and you went back 500 years to horse and cart, and you just were like, oh, okay, I'm going to like change out this wagon wheel that you have for this radically better carbon fiber, super perfectly balanced, hyper functional wheel. And it's a better cart. It is, but it's silly. It's crazy. Like you're not using the technology appropriately. And and in particular, if you're just like, oh, okay, so we've got this horse and he's sort of favoring one of his legs, and so I'm going to chop that leg off and build a robotic horse leg and nail it to him and put a gas, and then he'll be back to normal. It's like, no, he isn't. And so if you just did that piecemeal until the entire horse and cart was now just a fully roboticized, thing with a robot with a whip that was going back and forth at horses that were, like those robo dogs that Boston Dynamics has. And you were like, okay, we're in the future now. Well, in one sense, yes, but in another sense, you're sort of wasting all the technology. And so this is sort of a ground up rethink, given that we have the internet, given that information is something that we can spread around the world very reliably, very trustably. Uh, what does that mean for these financial markets? And what it means is they can become radically less expensive, radically more effective, and radically more profitable as well. The it's not the people running the CME group in the city of Chicago that get that hundreds of billions of dollars that are being skimmed out of the system. The they're getting billions of dollars out of the hundreds of billions. That system could be dropped in cost by 50%, and their personal incomes could go up by a factor of 10, and there would still be a huge amount of room between what the costs of the system are and what they're actually taking out of the system. So there's a lot of opportunity to actually change how things work, and this exists across a lot of different fields. That's getting to our podcast. That's sort of what we're talking about. The Marty's a lot more positive on generative AI than I am, but what I can say about generative AI is making it a lot more obvious that these capabilities exist and can be commonly accessed.
Okay, so what I'm trying to understand is, so this new system can, in theory, eliminate like the monopolization of markets and like hoarding all the market share from big
Well,
corporations.
so sort of yes, but that's not a necessarily useful way to think about these things. So
Okay.
markets have value to their by drawing in everyone.
Hmm.
So so let's say you have like a small private farm and you grow some wheat, and you've got a friend that owns a mill, and he's got a friend that owns a bakery, and the guy that owns the bakery is pretty successful, and so you grow your wheat, you hand it to your buddy that owns the mill, he mills flour, hands it to his buddy that owns a bakery, and he feeds, he makes the best croissants in town and everybody knows it, and so people buy his rolls every day, and he pays his buddy, and his buddy pays you. The three of you don't care what the market is. Like, it doesn't matter to you because you've got an environment, you're fine. But what happens to the two of them if there's a mudslide and your farm's wiped out? Well, their businesses are wiped out. What happens to the two of you if the baker, has a major coronary because he eats croissants all day long? Well, your income stream vanished. What if the miller was pretty good at running a mill, except he didn't understand about maintenance, and the machine breaks and you don't have enough money sitting in your bank account to fix it? Well, again, you're all screwed. So the value of having a large competitive space all coming together is that as inevitable problems occur, other people's problems don't become your problems.
Right.
And so this market system would have as its value proposition everybody coming on board, or large numbers of people coming on board, in order to create that safety. Now, what we've been seeing happen in our system in response to the very high costs of using our markets is that very large corporations are building up because they can, essentially, because you can internalize those costs yourself, take those risks yourself, and reap some of those benefits yourself. But then your benefits are costs on the system, which once again show up in sort of the broader range of things. So in one sense, the introduction of this new market thing would increase everybody coming together in these kinds of marketplaces, and so you'd have, in that sense, a greater sort of monopolization of market share. It all is coming together within its market. On the other hand, because the transaction costs are so much lower, some of these larger organizations might not do so well if they can't at least match the efficiency of independent actors acting within the marketplace, and truly have lower cost of production, uh, lower marginal cost of production, higher marginal value of consumption.
Okay, okay, I understand. Okay, that sounds a lot better actually. Um, that sounds better because if if you're sovereign in your production and you don't have to outsource and you can handle if something goes wrong, you can handle it internally. I could see how people could view that as, you know, more efficient and probably better for distributing product. I mean, um, I have another question about that actually. How did um how did you arrive to this system and how did you derive it from game theory specifically?
So pretty much same question both ways.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how to get consensus on a network. So the Internet of Things, just internal corporate communication, particularly when a lot of the elements in a corporation are actually machines that we didn't have generative AI to sort of wave its hand around and scream at us about what was going on. So when you have a bunch of different signals that don't necessarily have anything to do with each other, how do you come up with a common understanding of what's going on? This is also similar to the cognitive problem of how multiple senses can integrate, the information around you to come up with a common picture of what's going on. Because particularly in this day and age, what we're listening to doesn't anything to do with what we can see. If you've got headphones on, you could be listening to, a rock concert while you're looking at a sunset. Um, so that's sort of where I started. I was thinking about that structure and wanting to find something that would cause common consensus. And in game theory, there's this thing called evolutionary game theory. If you have large numbers of players with defined roles playing a game over and over again and getting individualized outcomes, it is the nature of that system that if those players um, have sort of random strategies, but are play them to the degree with which they're rewarded, or stop playing them to the degree with they're punished, then that system as a whole will tend towards equilibrium states. And that there's certain kinds of games, so-called coordination games or stagnation games, that have very well defined coordination structure where they converge towards something that's knowable. And so the idea is, what if I took these two ideas, this way of creating a knowable convergence and this structure of a system converging towards its convergence over time, and I combine those two things together around a specific set of roles based around coming up with one of these information sources. And so the idea was that somebody that wanted a particular piece of information would be able to pay for that information by using this to make the incentives as efficient as possible across a network. And then uh, once I'd solved that, I figured out that if you have a marketplace system, an idea around these makings of deals and people willing to give up capital in order to get better deals, then you can sort of combine this network of informants that wants to be incentivized to provide information with this person that wants an incentive to provide information, to acquire information efficiently, and sort of create this recursive thing where the market pays itself for telling itself what it knows in as efficient a manner as possible. And that's that was the problem. That was the problem I set for myself to solve. And once I solved it, that's when I discovered that it's considerably more effective than the markets that we presently have.
Once you get your patent and you got everything rolling, how long do you think it's going to take people to adopt this? And do you think there's going to be any resistance initially to adopt this new market system?
Well, there's already been considerable resistance, both with adoption
I can
and with the
imagine.
patent. Um,
Okay.
the patent has been accepted twice. Each of the acceptances have been rejected by the patent office, each time
Okay.
for reasons which the patent office is not willing to publicly endorse as reasonable. Um,
Mm.
the first one, we my attorneys and I destroyed, and they acknowledged that it was destroyed, which is why they accepted the second time. The second one, the my patent examiner and his supervisor communicated directly with my attorneys and said that they don't agree with this, but they've been told not to move forward for reasons which didn't make any sense to them. And so this objection that didn't make any sense was as good as they could do, and they wouldn't reverse this decision based on the fact that it doesn't make any sense, because they already know that. So that process is being appealed, and that appeal is to be heard July 2025. So we'll see
Okay.
what happens eventually. Uh,
Right.
Outside of the patent, there's been pretty stiff resistance in many of the people that I've spoken to. I have a handful of people around the world that are actually working on either setting up these kinds of systems or trying to get me in contact with people who'd be in a position to set these kinds of systems up. But we'll see. A market can't run on its own, and so it needs participants that are interested and willing in doing something with it. And so that's the basic challenge. Uh, my guess is that it would probably take somewhere in the 2 to 500 range of human beings that were interested and willing to actually do something to advance the cause, not necessarily build the entire thing or anything like that, but just almost anything to do the tipping point. And as I say, I'm at around half a dozen right now, which is about double it was this time last year. So progress is being made, but it is slow. Once it's rolling, it's fairly unlikely that resistance would be effective. The markets that we currently have were developed in northern Italy and essentially kicked off the Renaissance. At that time, the economy of northern Italy and everywhere else in the Mediterranean was dominated by Constantinople, now Istanbul, because, quite frankly, it's, as Napoleon pointed out, the most strategic point on Earth. It is the Bosporus, the sort of the bridge between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, are two extremely well-traveled, extremely easy to navigate waterways that have a large number of high civilizations around them and have had that for millennia. And so controlling that choke point gives you an enormous advantage in trade, and cities in that location have been taking advantage of that again for millennia. Uh, and it is a testament to the power of the current market design that basically barbarian hinterland, people were able to take over the economy from the world's most advanced and developed city, uh, pretty much because everyone could get a better deal by dealing with, the people in Naples or Milan or Venice than they could by going to where everybody had to go with everything that they had in order to get between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. And so the same thing applies here. Um, these systems, once set up and once actually, you know, increasing farmer or miner or fisher or logger revenues by, or actually profits by 50 to, in some cases, maybe as much as 500 or 600%, are going to pretty rapidly become the only thing that people in those lines of work are going to be voluntarily willing to engage with. And the only way to stop them would be, again, going back to the totalitarian, dictatorship days of the 2000s. The governments of would have to be willing to murder those people to keep them using the systems that are in place, because it's essentially a choice between more money and less money.
Do you think in places where democracy and open free markets are a little bit newer than they are in America, do you think it would be easier to implement those cities in those nations where people are just now becoming accustomed to capitalism and free markets and they haven't really seen the ramifications of it yet?
The places in which people are currently working to do that are developing marketplaces. I have a guy in Switzerland that's trying to set up a coffee index in East Africa, and another guy in South Africa trying to set up a coal index. Um,
Okay,
I I would separate democracy, free markets, and capitalism from one another. They are not, in
definitely,
my
definitely.
view, the same or even similar concepts. Um,
Mhm.
this structure is specifically one of the design concerns. In fact, is what happens under totalitarian control, uh, and this fails gracefully under those circumstances. Um, so this is a system that could be operated by a totalitarian and national government or regional government in order to manage its economy in a way that was profitable for its own ends, to produce wealthy citizens or high GDP or something like that. Um, and it's independent largely of those things. It's simply an efficient mechanism for finding the best level of trade, given whatever the circumstances actually existing are.
So it's highly versatile, basically, what you're saying.
Yeah. I think in particular, there's a number of markets around the world that are are sort of getting a double bite out of the apple, because that property of markets that causes sort of there to only be one of them that means anything, means that right now, because of history, essentially all the meaningful markets are either in London or Chicago, with a handful in New York and a few other places, which means that for people that are operating outside of those regions, which, might be Iowa and it might be, Zimbabwe, um, in either case, you're sort of paying a tax, outside the system. Now, for Iowans, it's a little bit less strenuous because at least you're inside the United States with some of them. But for copper miners coming out of Wisconsin, or Michigan, they're doing the round trip to London, and similarly, corn growers in Somerset are doing the round trip to Chicago for pricing levels. So it's not all gravy, and so creating these sorts of markets gives the potential to break that existing hold, and for a country that is perhaps a leading producer but not actually operating a market, it would be able to internalize even more of its value chain, which is something that a lot of these markets are very interested in looking into.
How does inflation impact this, or does it impact it at all?
So inflation is interesting, because it's essentially just noise in the signal. Uh,
Okay.
Inflation is caused by changing the amount of money that exists in the system. And as that money is created, it goes through the system in a relatively predictable way. I've described this to some other people before, but there's essentially three phases of inflation. Phase one, asset prices go up. And this is where everybody's happy. And this is exactly when you could stop it, but nobody ever does. Phase two is when commodity prices go up. And some people are happy with that, and some people are not happy with that. But it's kind of too late. The only way to actually get rid of the inflation at that point is to go back and deflate the asset prices. Phase three, and this is the phase we're in right now, is when wages go up. And at this point, it's too late. The inflation happened already. Food is now costs more, gas now costs more, clothing now costs more because commodity prices went up. And so if wages don't go up, people will start starving to death, and then they'll start murdering their bosses and anyone else they can get their hands on in order to get access to food and clothing again. And so this is when everybody complains. Everybody's like, "Oh, inflation is awful. We should stop it right now." And of course, you can't anymore because it's built in. One of the problems with the existing marketplace's present-based conception of trade and personal-based conception of trade is that there can be a separation between that first phase of inflation and the phase that we're in right now. So nobody complained about the stock market taking off to the moon in the 90s, and nobody complained about housing prices taking off to the moon in the 2000s. And after both of those things crashed, massive governmental interventions, in some cases international, were done to assure that nothing would ever impact the fictional gains that had been made under those wildly inflationary behaviors. And we are now seeing the consequence of that as housing prices are too ridiculous for people to actually get, and wages are starting to come up to claw back essentially half a century of lying to ourselves about how much wealth there actually was in the system. It's actually much more than half a century, sadly. So what this system does, because it's based on common consensus of negotiating about the future, is that as inflation happens, whereas in the existing system, which is much more based on rates of change, the system itself makes money on that exponential ramp up of the bubble, and the system itself also makes money on the catastrophic drop of the fall of the bubble. It's the economy that suffers from both of those things happening. Since my system is focused on the gains of the economy, it creates an incentive to recognize and a space to actually see the exponential ramp up of bubbles and the pre-popping of same without actually damaging the underlying economy. And so the positive incentive of that initial asset gain turns almost immediately into the commodity gain, which would drag the asset gain in the commodity space, which would be popular with the people that like it when the commodity prices go up, but would mean that the people who actually cause the inflation, who own the assets, did not gain anything from it because the commodity prices, they'd actually be giving the money to other people. And since that's not what they're doing it for, they're doing it to take it themselves, that would serve as a strong counter incentive, as well as a common forum to negotiate how to get through inflationary or deflationary bouts that occur within the sort of hurly-burly of an economy dealing with itself.
Interesting. Um, in terms of, I'd say like, in terms of, I guess I don't really like the term third world countries, but countries with a far lesser GDP that are completely reliant on the selling of their resources that usually don't have too much domestic, you know, value in terms of production. They only rely on pretty much exporting their um, commodities. Wouldn't your system, in fact, make these countries more wealthy?
Absolutely. Now, I would caution you, it is not really the case that there are any countries primarily economically focused. Services are a large and growing share of basically every economy on the planet these days.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty deeply unfortunate because most of those services are actively harmful. Uh, but
Mhm.
but there's a lot more development. We're not living in the 1950s or the 1850s. Things are
Right.
are changing very radically. Uh, one point when was it 5 or 7 different countries in North Africa all had coups like in the same week. Something that's underappreciated is that the median age in these countries is in the teens. Um, so half of all the people are under 16 or 17 or 18 or 19 in a few cases. So if you're thinking about a population where the median person is a teenager, uh, a high school. Imagine
Yeah.
an entire country that's a high school. How does
Essentially.
that work? Well, you know, they all had coups. It's sort of it's a little crazy. Um,
Yeah. Wow.
so the world's a very dynamic place. There's a lot of stuff moving around, but for countries whose primary value proposition is their enormous resources, which also includes places like the United States of America, which produces an extraordinary fraction of the world's agricultural output, um, making producing much more valuable makes countries that can produce things much more valuable.
So, question I actually wanted to ask you, just something unrelated, but I mean maybe related. I listened to one of your other podcasts on I'm trying to remember the name of the podcast. It was corporate something, but I listened to that podcast and I heard in that podcast you had mentioned you had studied nuclear engineering at one point when you were in school. I wanted to know a little bit more of that because that's like one of my fascinations is nuclear fusion and fission.
Okay, sure, yeah. I went to engineering school at UVA. At the
Mhm.
time, they had a nuclear reactor on grounds.
Oh wow.
Grounds is UVA's word for campus. Uh, the year that I entered as a full-on undergrad was the year that they had dropped the nuclear engineering major. the Board of Visitors was very anti-nuclear, and they wanted to shut the program down, and they ultimately did. However, one of the instructors there was a pretty good teacher that I had met through core instruction, and so I took a couple of his classes, got the idea for my senior thesis, and was introduced to a thesis advisor from the program, who then gave me a 1-year fellowship to go to grad school inside the Department of Nuclear Engineering as the last person admitted there. I was working on a sort of research survey of ways to turn a computer simulation into a mathematical model using this technique called autocorrelation. And so that's what I did. And the system, if you're interested in fission and fusion, this is sort of a middle ground. There's a concept called an energy amplifier, and it depends on a physical phenomenon called spallation. Lead, bismuth, several other heavyish atoms, not the super heavies that fission very well, but still quite heavy. If you hit them with a fairly high speed proton, so 1 GeV, if a particle's rest mass and kinetic energy are roughly equivalent, then it's traveling at relativistic velocities, basically. So these things are traveling at a pretty decent fraction of the speed of light. But they're not that difficult to produce, 1 GeV protons. Hydrogen is very, very common, and you don't need deuterium or anything special like that. So anyway, if these 1 GeV protons hit a lead target, say, then and they get absorbed by a lead atom, the lead atom does this sort of vibration thing and undergoes this weird spallation process where it will shake off 50 to 70 neutrons. Neutrons are what make fission go. And the way that fission goes is something called a chain reaction. So the idea is that when a neutron hits a uranium or plutonium or a thorium atom, the atom absorbs it, becomes too unstable, it splits in half. As a result of that splitting in half, you get usually 2 other pretty decent-sized atomic nuclei. Generally, they're both reasonably radioactive. Sometimes they're very unreasonably radioactive. And you get a few other things, generally some neutrons popping out, usually 3 to 5 neutrons. So if, on average, one of those neutrons gets absorbed by some other fissile particle and does the same thing again, you have a sustained chain reaction. If on average more than one, then you're supercritical and the reaction exponentially ramps up. If there's less than one, then you're subcritical and your system exponentially ramps down. So are you familiar with like Zeno's paradox? Like if you keep taking half steps, you never get there. But of course, 1/2 plus a quarter
Yeah.
plus an eighth plus a 16th is basically the same as 1.
Yeah.
Well, the greater sort of a piece of a step that you take, the faster convergence is, the higher the number is. So if you take 1 plus a half plus a quarter, what I was thinking in the first place, that converges to 2. But if you take 1 plus 2/3 plus 4/9, and like that converges to 3. And if it's 9/10, that'll converge to 10. And if it's 99/100, that'll converge to 100. And so you could create a reactor array that's subcritical, say 0.95. And then every neutron will, on average, produce 20 things before it sort of fizzles out and peters out. Which, under ordinary circumstances, it's permanently off. But if we combine it with the spallation thing, where we take 50 neutrons and we dump them into that system, then suddenly we get 1,000 nuclear reactions every time we do one spallation. And so if you can get all the math to work out so that the energy it takes to create the spallating event, hydrogen coming in, can be paid for by the amount of energy produced by the outcome coming out, what you get is this system that is permanently turning itself off because it's intrinsically subcritical and operating at a radically higher neutron density than normal reactors, which actually degrades most of the kinds of nuclear waste that we're really concerned about. Things like long-term or fissile materials like plutonium and stuff like that we could use to build bombs, or some of the nastier kinds of dirty, devices and so on. And also, breeding becomes more practical. So you might be familiar with thorium machines and how that allows us to convert thorium, which isn't particularly fissile, inside the system into uranium-233, which is particularly fissile, but is super radioactive. So you just leave it in there and burn it, and it's all fine. This would do similar kinds of things, and so we'd be able to use depleted uranium, convert it into plutonium, and then burn the plutonium at a faster rate. So it's not fertile. It's not actually producing excess, but it's just creating and burning things up, because you can use up 2 neutrons to do one thing, because you can operate in a sort of whole environment. And so you get hypothetically, you get fusion-like levels of reaction product, so very low levels of actually radioactive materials, combined with fission-like levels of actual control. Fission systems are buildable with, mechanics tools and sort of systems that human beings could reach out and touch, at least before you inundate them with the radioactive material. Whereas fusion systems, use all the tokamak and bottle stuff, and plasmas are way too hot to get anywhere close to. So yeah, it's an intriguing sort of an idea, and one of the ideas that I play around and chew on every once in a while is thinking about what we might be able to do to improve the industrial nature of power production with nuclear technology. But most nuclear technology is too illegal and too expensive to get into. So I don't spend a lot of time concerning myself with that. But who knows? If we double the size of the human economy, maybe coming up with a way to make energy 10 or 100 or even 1,000 times cheaper, which is well within the physics of the system, would be another great idea that we could have.
Yeah, I'm all for low cost energy. It would be almost near free at that point. I mean, and it's a lot of people don't understand how safe it is in compared to what we do now.
The energy amplifier people have a model where it becomes inexpensive enough that thorium extraction from seawater is actually economically viable. At which point you're talking about a pretty serious paradigm shift in terms of what it looks like to have an energy grid and power production. And again, going back to the richer countries, poorer countries, I've pointed this out many times, but if you've ever seen one of those night sky maps, where it's the sort of map of the world in sort of false color with what it sort of looks like on night side with the cities lit up and so on. And if you look at UN maps of per capita GDP, like region colored. So, New York and London are very wealthy, and, the middle of nowhere, and the middle of nowhere is very poor. Those maps are identical. North Korea is this blank spot,
Yeah,
between
I've seen
South
it.
Korea, which is lit up by a light bulb, and,
Right.
parts of China, which are also lit up by a light bulb, which are both, you know, South Korea is like green and the North China is like blue, and then North Korea is like black basically
Yeah.
in the other thing. And
Yeah.
the same thing happens in Africa. The parts of Africa that are doing well have electric lights, and the lights come on at night. And the parts of Africa that aren't doing so well, they don't have that. The same thing happens in the United States. We have poor parts. This Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is one of the poorest places in the country, but also multiple places across the Midwest and in other little pockets. And again, you don't see them at night. There's no lights there. So power is what makes things go, quite literally, and economic well-being is very tightly coupled to how much energy people actually have. And so it's a being more efficient is great as far as it goes, but actually having more capacity is a lot greater.
Yeah, I'd love to see a world lit up and not, so much disparity and so much, difference in wealth. But yeah, did you happen to catch Oppenheimer?
I didn't get out to the movies much these days. I'm kind of busy with my projects a lot of the time, and actually,
Mm,
it's a little on the nice side. My sort of basic use of the movie industry is sort of an escapist stress relief, and
Oppenheimer.
to some extent, hanging out in my living room and talking to people around the world through Skype, which is a lot of what my day sort of actually winds up looking like, isn't that stressful for me. So I don't really feel the need to go blow off steam. I did see the trailer, and I was really fascinated. The shots of the nuclear explosion. I'm gonna have to see them sort of in context and for real at some point, because there are some actually incredibly famous and insane photographs that were taken literally billionths of a second into the detonations of these bombs, and the bits of the explosions that I saw in the trailers look like physical explosions that match the shape of those photographs. And so just like seeing how that happens, and in particular knowing that Nolan does things so practically, I think that would be fascinating. The behind the scenes in whatever they did, it would only be very slightly disappointing if it was purely CGI. But if they actually got explosions to explode right, that would be amazing, and I would be very interested in
Yeah.
discovering how they did it.
Yeah, I mean, Nolan's known for, not using CGI, so I'd be highly intrigued on how he pulled those explosions off. Is there like a difference between like a nuclear explosion and just like a fire carbon based explosion
Oh,
in nature?
absolutely, yes. They're not even remotely based on the same concept. So,
Okay.
uh, the what's happening in an atomic bomb is that supercriticality I was talking about before
Hmm.
is essentially taken up to 11.
Oh wow.
The time period of the doubling is in the prompt range, which means essentially every 10,000th of a second, the criticality multiplier is being applied. And you're looking for criticality multipliers that are in the sort of 0.3 to 0.4 range. So call it 4/3. So 21, 4/3 of the 21 is about 2 to the 42, which is right around 4 trillion, and 3 to the 21 is around 10 billion. So, uh, so 4 trillion divided by 10 billion is 400. Every 21 10,000ths of a second, the power output increases by a factor of 400. So what happens is that this enormous globe of gamma radiation is pushed out, and gamma is even more penetrative than X-ray, and so it just goes right through the bomb casing and the air. And whereas if you had like a black powder explosion or a stick of dynamite or something like that, the chemical reactions of the breakdown cause a thermal expansion at the point of where those chemicals actually are. In the case of a nuclear explosion, what's going on is this enormous dump of light particles is moving out in a sphere and being absorbed and re-radiated in some cases, but in some cases turning into thermal energy by propelling the actual particle outwards by the surroundings. So if the thing is underground, then the ground itself is suddenly getting very hot in a wide radius. If it's in the air, then it's the air doing that. If it's next to the water, it's the water doing that. And so it's imagine sort of an open microwave that's operating at a power level that could run an entire city. It's the stuff around it that's blowing up effectively. And because that radial action is highly radial, the shape is very, very, very spherical with a few sort of nodules based on some very, discrete density differences in the atomic structure surrounding the specific space that's blowing up. And so the sort of familiar mushroom clouds, we have seen that very large explosions turn into mushroom clouds of their own accord. That's just sort of part and parcel of how the physics of hot things work. But that sort of specifically nuclear mushroom with that very, very spherical outcome that is shown off in like the Castle Bravo, the hydrogen explosions and so on, that's highly distinctive and shows up in the way that it's producing energy and the way that energy is being dumped into its environment is a completely different idea than a classical explosion.
I guess that's all the questions I had. Uh, is there any way people can find you and support your cause and get you closer to this new future?
Absolutely, yeah. You can reach out to me. I'm at noahphealy@yahoo.com or connect to me on LinkedIn. You go there, you'll also be able to find, I'll be posting this podcast, other podcasts I've done. I've got my own podcast, as I said before, with Marty Wiener. It's called The Fourth Age. Come out, listen to us talk about AI and how computational mathematics is interacting with our day-to-day lives. And there's also a website, coordisc.com, COORDISC, where you can learn more about coordinated discovery markets and how they work. And so, yeah, that's how to get in touch with me.
Cool, man. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your brilliance. I mean, I'm pretty sure my viewers are gonna have to watch this more than one time. Uh, Thank you for everything, all the information you've given us, and I hope you the best of luck in getting your patent and implementing your new market system.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
You as well. Thank you. I hope you have a good New Year too. Have a good
Yes, yes.
2024
Happy
as
New
well.
Year, everybody.
Yep. Thank you, man. I really appreciate the time. I hope we get to talk again soon. You're fascinating, dude. You know a lot.
Well, thanks. That was my major hobby before math was just learning things.
And I like listening. So hopefully I get to talk to you again soon. And that's Don't Sing Podcast. Thank you so much for your time.
I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living.
Bottom line, there were no weapons of mass destruction.
Totally unjustified and brutal invasion of Iraq. I mean, of Ukraine.
A new world order. A new world order can emerge. A new era.
No, don't clap, man, because I got more
And Hillary, our demons. Feeling peace in our time.
Most people still want to run for vote.
Peace in all time.